Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Financial holocaust, financial terror, financial apartheid. Yes, holocaust and terror and apartheid are the lions and tigers and bears of our day. But, Dorothy, you can rise up. Just click your heels and storm the palaces with a collateralized debt obligation of your own. So let's take Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, St. James Palace, and Windsor Palace. Roll the palaces into one highly leveraged collateralized palace obligation and reconquer the world. We can do it, Dorothy's, with a royal assignat of our own, the people's infinitely rehypothecated palace obligation bonds. What a fantastic idea, Stacy Herbert.
Of course, only in the UK would they come up with an idea of backing their wealth, of creating wealth through property. So this is the first headline, Max, and it's Turn Crown Estate into Sovereign Wealth Fund, Labour MPs to urge. Britain's £8.6 billion Crown Estate should be turned into a sovereign wealth fund to rival governments-backed investment funds that have sprung up across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia in the last 20 years, a group of Labour MPs will say this week.
Basically, this is a great idea because other countries, like Norway, famously, have a sovereign wealth fund from all that North Sea oil. Britain could have had a sovereign wealth fund had they created one based on their North Sea oil, but instead they plowed that into house speculation and bubbles. You know, part of the reason they don't have a sovereign wealth fund is due to the bubble popping in 2008. Norway was not so foolish. Other countries have sovereign wealth funds. Here in the UK, they're saying take the palaces that are owned by the Crown, I think you mentioned £8 or £9 billion worth, wrap those into a palace-backed bond, essentially, and then you can use that as a fractional palace lending obligation facility and spin that to 80, 90, 100 billion pounds to go out there and buy strategic assets around the world. I'm not sure why this is not a good idea. I think the Queen would be more than happy to add something useful to the economy after 50 or 60 years of sitting on her duff. And here's a way to turn her assets into something that could be productive. I'm all for it.
Well, the Crown Estate is £8.6 billion worth. It's the palaces, the land, but also large parts of Regent Street and Oxford Street, all that area. They did have an 11% return on it. Now this money, however, they do not control. It goes directly to the Treasury. So what they're saying is that they could use, I guess, leverage it up and invest overseas in China and Hong Kong and in infrastructure projects domestically and to pay down debts. So I'm assuming they want to leverage it up and use this as more of a speculative vehicle because all these other sovereign wealth funds that they talk about are dominated by oil and natural gas, which puts a lie to the fact that you could somehow like magically spin your way with debt and financial products into the wealthiest nations in the world.
Well, it goes back to the creation of the petrodollar in the 1970s when the U.S. defaulted on their bonds and went off the gold standard. That was the first major default by America of their bonds in 100 years. Then they went on this petrodollar standard and increased the supply of dollars around the world, and other countries, starting really in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in the late 80s, started to build up these huge reserves. China has trillions of dollars in reserves made up of $1 trillion US dollars and then more trillions of other currencies. And of course, these other countries like Norway have these huge strategic sovereign wealth funds. Britain, however, they sold 60% of their gold under Gordon Brown. They have no sovereign wealth fund, and they've got an economy that's overly reliant on fraud and rehypothecation. So yes, I say to the Queen, Elizabeth, respectfully, turn all that unused collateral into something that can help the nation. Think of it as being on the vanguard in this global financial war. I mean, isn't that sexy? Don't you want to be a war queen? You can be like, there's a financial war going. We're going to put up the palace as collateral to fight the financial war. You know, it's exciting. Get on TV, make a few speeches. You can make a movie about you. You'd be as famous as some of these previous monarchs they've made movies about that are now canonized in Hollywood. You too can be famous in Hollywood too, yes?
Well, in the US and UK, we have sovereign debt funds, you could say. But to show you the size and the scale of the sovereign wealth funds in the rest of the world, the number one is Norway, which has $737 billion. Number two is Saudi Arabia, then Abu Dhabi. China has two different funds, which are in the top five. Kuwait, Hong Kong, Singapore, Russia, and Singapore. So you see that the only way up there is either to have natural wealth of oil or commodities, or you actually have to work for a living and export and create things.
Well, that's a good point. Either you have workers that are exporting and you can have a sovereign wealth fund like China, or you've got oil that you're exporting that can create a sovereign wealth fund. In the UK, you have neither. You have neither a robust export market, or do you have any more oil, because the North Sea oil is now basically kaput, and no amount of shale drilling is ever going to replace that supply of gas and oil. So, and I just want to correct myself, Helen Mirren did do an excellent job portraying Queen Elizabeth in the West End during some production where she wore the tiara and uttered a few nonsensical gibberish, as monarchs do. But here's what I'm saying, go big time. Go big. Go big, 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 big. Don't settle for just a West End production of your life. Get a big freaking Hollywood thing going on. You can do it if you put up the palaces as collateral for a sovereign wealth-based, rehypothecated debt obligation bond that will take, she could probably buy the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund. And then just take that. Think imperial. You're a queen. Think like a queen. Jesus.
Well, speaking of a queen, David Cameron is in my next headline. David Cameron, profit and tax cuts are not dirty words. So the Prime Minister told the Tory conference that firms must be responsible and accused Labour of anti-business agenda. So he said that this is no longer the party. We're not going to say that profits are a dirty word.
I'm saying if David Cameron really believes that profits not a dirty word, then why not go to Google, Amazon, and Vodafone and say, well, if you're making all these profits, then why don't we tax you on those profits? In other words, these companies, Google, Amazon, Vodafone, and others, they don't believe in profits because then they'd have to pay taxes. So they don't report any profits, or barely a minuscule amount of profits.
True.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, okay, here you have the companies that sponsor David Cameron. They don't believe in profits enough to report them. So David Cameron, or here's another thing. How about the taxpayer in the UK are taxed only on their profits instead of their total revenues? Like a corporation. Corporations are only taxed on revenue and on profits that are adjusted after all the deductions. How about taxpayers saying, well, after I adjust all my revenue in the same way a corporation does, oh, by the way, I didn't make any profits last year, therefore my tax liability should be zero. About either have one or the other. As I've said before, David Cameron, you're a duplicitous douche, and you should STFU. Or just go away, nobody likes you. Just STFU, just go away.
Well, this is Hollywood accounting, to never have profits. So this is something that he aspires to anyway. They want to attract Hollywood. He and George Osborne have talked about attracting Hollywood. They have more Hollywood productions here than Hollywood. So this is something that they want. And this is the accounting methodology of his government, where they never have a profit. That's part of the reason why we only have sovereign debt funds, is so that they could always say, oh, we're always in debt. We can't give you anything in exchange for all the taxes you're sending us. Well, at least in all these other 15, huge sovereign wealth funds around the world, they're getting something in exchange for all their national wealth. Here we get nothing but the Queen waving every once in a while when she drives past.
Look, Cameron is a special purpose vehicle, an SPV. And he's just a receptacle to put a lot of garbage rhetoric that he spews on the BBC. But when you add it all up and monetize what it's worth, it's negative value. He's actually dragging this, he's a negative sovereign wealth fund. Every time he opens his mouth, the sovereign wealth of Britain drops. Britain's sovereignty would increase if this guy STFU'd.
Well, one of the big backers of the Tory party, the Conservative Party, and David Cameron is Wonga. So speaking of profits, they're in this final headline here. Payday lenders are taking money they shouldn't from bank accounts. Now, the interesting thing of how they're able to do this is this concept, which is the concept of financialization. This is the reason why we only have sovereign debt funds and perpetual debt here, and debt spirals and deflationary spirals. And this is the concept called Continuous Payment Authority, CPA. It gives the company who you sign up to, whether it's like the gas company or any sort of service like Wonga, it gives the company power to take money out of your account via your debit card. Unlike a debit card, however, Max, you cannot cancel it yourself. You need to tell the company to stop taking money out of your account. The company can, however, automatically reinstate collections. Now, this practice is illegal in the United States, but it's legal here, and £2 billion over the past 4 years have been taken from British population out of their bank account through these methods.
Well, that's treason. In other words, part of the role of a prime minister is to protect the citizen from invasive predatory lenders or financial terrorists. And David Cameron has abdicated this role as protector of his people. He is letting Wonga that charges annualized rates of 5,000%, and meanwhile prosecuting loan sharks that he catches that are charging less, 3,000 or 3,500%. So again, here you have a prime minister that has committed acts of treason by allowing Wonga, which is a predatory financial terrorist, to have access directly to people's bank accounts. And I beseech the Queen to step in. Go down to the House of Commons. They'll let you in. And lecture David Cameron or just fire him. I believe it's within the monarchy. This is a constitutional monarchy. Constitution, monarchy. You've got equal billing, Queen. You've got right up there with the Constitution. There's the House of Parliament and there's the Queen. You're supposed to be like equal partners on all this. Go down there and fire his He's a treasonous he's no good. Get rid of him. You've got the power to do so.
I have to say that it is not just the conservatives that have done this. It also happened under Labor, New Labor. So this is a continuous payment authority that is allowed here for debt slaves. This is a concept that is why we don't have a sovereign wealth fund, is because we have continuous payment authority. This is the financialization, the constant interest payments. Now, in 2009, the law changed so that if you tell your bank to cancel the payments, they must do so. If the bank continues to allow payments out of your account, then in theory it needs to refund you and reimburse the charges. However, banks have not always applied these rules because there's different regulatory authorities controlling the banks and then the payday lenders. And they're neither saying that the other party is responsible, they say, for taking these continuous payment authorities.
Well, I mean, HSBC would have to take time off from laundering money for Mexican drug cartels when they're responsible for the death of 60,000 Mexicans beheaded to launder money for HSBC. They'd have to take a break from doing all that.
Hey, don't diss the profits, man.
Oh, yeah. No matter where they come from, it's all good. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to New York. Speak with Dr. Michael Hudson, author of The Bubble and Beyond. Michael Hudson, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, Max.
All right, Michael Hudson, despite interest rates at record lows, the Prime Minister here in the UK has had to introduce a scheme to underwrite 15% of the deposit on properties valued at up to £600,000. What does this tell you?
It tells me that England is doing exactly the same thing that Australia and the United States are doing. Their banks are in trouble, and what they want to do is reinflate the real estate market so that the prices will be high enough to cover all of the bad loans that British banks have made. In Australia, they're giving similar pushes. In the United States, the Federal Housing Authority has said, well, we can lend money, government guaranteed loans to home buyers up to 43% of their wages. So what you're seeing is a huge transfer payment of wages into the hands of the banks, making loans to buy high-priced real estate. And the amazing thing is that in London, just as in America and Australia, they're saying that homeowners are getting rich from the rising price of their homes that the government is pushing up, when they're not getting rich at all. They're just getting further in debt, and it's the banks that are bailed out. So while the London government is pretending to help homeowners, they're really helping the banks.
Right. You started off by saying that the banks are in trouble, so they are bringing in this government-backed scheme. But they're pushing it here in the UK as an opportunity for people to get on the property ladder, as it's called. But as you're pointing out, this is about, once again, bailing out the banks, correct?
That's correct.
All right, let me ask you this. You know, when the government subsidizes the property market and people can use their homes as collateral to go to the bank and take money out, the so-called turning your house into an automatic teller machine, they're subsidizing people who are now part of this new rentier class in the UK. At the same time, Dr. Hudson, they're penalizing people who are on so-called benefits. They're victimizing one group of people that the government subsidizes, but they're lauding another group of people that are also being subsidized by the government. I have called this financial apartheid. They're discriminating against one group of people using finances and using interest rates. Your thoughts?
Well, there's a deception here. You use the term that they use your home like a piggy bank. When you take money out of a piggy bank, you don't owe a debt. You simply have let saving. But what they really mean is instead of taking money out of the piggy bank, take out a loan and you're going to have to empty your piggy bank in the future. And the future saving that you do to pay this money that you're borrowing is going to take the form of paying down a debt, not of accumulating money in a bank account. So they, by using the rhetoric to pretend that what they're doing is helping the homeowners, they've turned economic language upside down and made it appear as if people actually have a bank asset when actually it's going into debt. They call debt saving, and that's crazy.
All right, let's talk about the U.S. housing for a second. In the U.S., the property market is also booming, but half of the properties being sold are paid for entirely in cash, primarily from private equity and hedge funds using their own cash, of course, or other people's cash. Talk about this phenomenon.
Well, that's not a bubble phenomenon. That's the actual reverse. Now that the Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates, as you pointed out, to under 1% for bank borrowing, the pension funds and the hedge funds saying, how are we going to make money more than the 1% that we can get in government bonds? So all of a sudden, instead of making loans to people to buy property, they're buying distressed properties, buying them up for at very low prices from the banks. And the way to make money now is by buying a house and renting it out. Well, the same thing is happening in America today that did happen during the bubble. When you have absentee owners buying houses, all of a sudden, what are they going to do? They're going to look around to find somebody who's willing to rent the house so that they can make a profit to cover their current expenses, as well as making the capital gain they want. So the higher that house prices go in these hedge fund areas, the lower the rents go, because now they're looking for somebody to buy for rent. So what you're having indeed is 100% hedge funds coming in. They're hoping now that they can sell out is a capital gain, and in fact, they've made 20% over the last 2 years on the run-up so far. But now the Federal Reserve has the following problem. The economy is not recovering. People are not having enough jobs to pay high rent. So all of a sudden, all these hedge fund purchases need somehow to get the market pushed up so that they can cash out and take their capital gains at the expense of homeowners, at the expense of people who are actually going to live in these homes. And that's what economic policy is all about in the United States right now.
Well, if we look at the recent history of these financial predators going back 5 or 6 years, they were making these no-income, no-asset loans, ninja loans, to people really in a way that was completely asymmetric, if you will, in terms of the risk, because the banks were able to sell that risk on, where the homeowners accepted all the risk. They got these homeowners into enormous debt. Then all the banks decided, you know what, we're going to go into debt. We're going to have a banking crisis because we inflated a huge bubble. Then they went in and they illegally foreclosed on these properties. They stole the property from these people that they fraudulently sold the mortgages to begin with, and trading on inside information against their own clients, as Goldman Sachs did. Now what you're saying is 5 or 6 years later, after basically throwing these people out into the street, they end up buying them for all cash with money that they get at 0% interest rate. They charge them rent on people that were living there to begin with, and now they're in a crisis again, which will probably lead to another bailout of the hedge funds like we saw with long-term capital management. Is that about it?
That's exactly what's happening, Max. You've got it.
Okay, so here you have a class of predatory financiers. I mean, in the UK, it's amazing to me that having the experience of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the UK seems like they're going to replicate an enormously flawed policy, and nobody seems to be calling it on them in the media, in the press, or in the City of London. And yet we know that these policies are going to fail. I've said that within 24 months, this UK housing bubble that George Osborne has created will collapse. Do you think my estimate is too aggressive, or
Well,
is it, go ahead.
Suddenly you've changed your language, Max. First of all, you say that the banks have pulled a great ripoff. You're absolutely right. And then you say this is a failed policy. It hasn't failed. It's screwed the people to help the banks. The banks are the people who run the government. That hasn't failed. That's a great success. Impoverishing the country, turning England into Greece, turning America into Latvia. That's their definition of success. That's not a failure. You've got to decide, is this which side are you on?
Well, if I remember my Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of Nations, this seems to be a repudiation of everything that was talked about during the Enlightenment, and now we have the bankruptcy of a nation using financial weapons of mass destruction, as Warren Buffett has called it, for the express purpose of impoverishing people. Why? Is that wrong?
That's absolutely correct. So if you're going to do the opposite of Adam Smith, what do? You make a big public relations campaign saying, Adam Smith is our patron saint. We're for free markets. And what they mean by free markets is turning Adam Smith upside down. To Adam Smith, as you just pointed out, a free market was one that was free of rentiers. Adam Smith said that the most logical tax was a land tax, to finally begin to recollect what the British landlords had taken after the Norman conquest. But now the free market means free for the banks, free for the landowners to exploit the rest of society and do what Ricardo accused them of doing, grinding industrial capitalism to a halt. So by bailing out the banks and the real estate sector, England, and raising the price of housing and raising the indebtedness of British workers, you can say goodbye to British manufacturing. How can Britain afford to hire workers when they have to pay such high costs for housing?
Right. Now, I want to get your comment to something that David Cameron said recently at his conference party speech. He said that Britain should not be afraid of profits and that profits is not a dirty word. But when I think about companies like Amazon, Google, and Vodafone here in the UK, they don't like profits because if they reported their profits, they'd have to pay taxes, which they don't. So is he just foolish? Is he inept? Is he, what's his problem? Is he just stupid, David Cameron, or is he just a tool of the bankers?
All of a sudden, there's a use of the word profit in a different way. You know, in our country, the hotel queen, the Queen of Mean, Leona Helmsley, said, only the little people pay taxes. You can say of Amazon and the others, only the little people make profits. Rich companies don't make profits. They make capital gains. They expense all of their profits, pretending to take them in offshore banking centers. I think either Amazon or Google operates out of Ireland or out of centers just like the oil companies operate out of flags of convenience. So the idea is not to declare a profit on your income. So if you look at the corporate profit statements and you compare them to the national income and product accounts, they're completely different because the government knows that all of these fictitious losses are not really losses. They know that the accountants are making the balance sheet. And when I worked for Chase Manhattan Bank and was trying to figure out what Standard Oil's position was. The Standard Oil treasurer, I said, where are the profits made? Are they made where you produce the oil abroad? Are they made here? And the treasurer said, well, they're made right here in my office. We make them wherever we find that we don't have to pay taxes on them. It's all a just pretend fictitious game. And you'd think that the law says you're not allowed to make a accounting statement that is unrealistic and to do a transaction solely for the purpose of avoiding taxes. And yet that's what most of the corporations do today. They make offshore balance sheet items. They make all sorts of foreign affiliates and banking enclaves for the sole purpose of not reporting profits in the countries where they're high, like Europe and North America.
Dr. Michael Hudson, I want to get your quick comment on something. I've noticed that Apple Computer's got about $150 billion parked offshore. They don't bring it into the United States because they don't want to pay taxes on that money. Here you have Carl Icahn, a corporate raider, having lunch and dinner with the CEO, Tim Cook, saying that we're going to get them to buy back their own stock. He tweets about it after he's bought the stock, and he makes $1 billion doing so. Isn't this just kind of like violating everything anyone would hold sacrosanct about markets and free markets? You've got insider trading, market manipulation, offshore tax avoidance, all wrapped up in one scenario between Carl Icahn and Apple. Is this the most egregious example of corporate malfeasance you've ever seen?
It's an exercise in surrealism. Here you have Apple, which is the most cash-rich company in the world, with over $50 billion. If there's any country in the world that doesn't have to borrow, that's Apple. What Icahn is doing is worse than what you described, Max. He's saying Apple should borrow the money here to buy its own stock. So despite having this huge cash savings offshore, it should borrow here and use the money not to make a profit, not to invest in more research and development, not to buy other companies that are useful for what it's doing, but simply to buy its own stock and make money from money financially. So essentially, you're having the absurdity of Apple borrowing money at the same time that its savings are going way up. This doesn't make any sense at all, except as a tax avoidance measure.
Right. So once again, we're back to only the little people report profits. All right, Dr. Michael Hudson, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
It's always a pleasure, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Hudson. If you want to contact us, please tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.